First graders, it's Mrs. Petlick here, back with your second read aloud for the week. Remember, yesterday we talked about being able to retell a story. So, in order to retell a story, we want to know what the most important pieces of information are from the beginning, the middle, and the end of a text. So, in order to do that, we need to figure out what the main idea is, which is what the text is mostly about, and all those important details that tell me about that main idea. So, in order to find out the main idea and those important details, we are going to look for something that repeats an idea, some words, whatever it is that might be continually repeating in the story. That's what we're going to work on today as we read our story. So, today we are going to be reading I Could Do That. Esther Morris Gets Women the Vote. So, this is another nonfiction book. It is telling us about Esther Morris, who grew up in a time when voting wasn't very fair. Men were allowed to vote, but women were not. So she was determined that she would change that and be able to help women also vote. In 1820, 6-year-old Esther McQuigg studied her mother making tea. I could do that, she said. Make tea? Asked Mama. The older girls do that. But I want to learn, said Esther. And she did. She pumped water into the kettle and set it on the wood stove to boil. She scooped tea leaves into the teapot, then poured steaming water over them. Esther strained the tea into cups, one for her mother and one for her. As they sat near the window of their New York house, Esther saw men riding by in their best suits, some carrying flags. Where are those men going, Mama? Asked Esther. They are going to vote for the next president of the United States, Mama said. Will Papa vote? Yes, Papa always votes. Will you vote, Mama? No, dear. Only the men can vote. When Esther was 8, she watched her mother sew a fine seam. The needle pulled thread in and out, tracking tiny even stitches across the fabric. Esther felt her hands mimicking her mother's. I could do that, she said, and she did. She made clothes for her dolls from scraps, and when her stitches became neat and straight, she sewed a shirt for Papa. When Esther was 11, her mother died, and for the first time she saw her father cry. He gathered his 11 children together. I don't know what I'll do without your mama, he said. I'm depending on each of you to be there and to take care of one another. Esther, 8th of the 11, cried too, but then she said, I can do that, Papa. And she did. So far, I keep hearing Esther say the words, I can do that. It's also the title of our story. So I'm going to assume that that is pretty important. We can tell in this first part of the story that Esther is very brave and she's very determined. Whatever she puts her mind to, she goes out and she accomplishes that. She does it. So I think a major part of this story is about Esther being brave and determined. When Esther was 19, 6 feet tall and on her own, she earned a living making dresses with leg of mutton sleeves for society ladies. When the ladies wanted hats to match the dresses, Esther designed and made those too. Soon, she thought of opening a shop. You are much too young to run a business, she was told. I don't see why, was Esther's reply, and with that, she opened a hat shop in New York. Esther started attending abolitionist meetings at the church, but a throng of people who believed in the right to own slaves threatened to stop the meetings, even if they had to tear down the Baptist church where they were held. You can't do that, Esther said. I'll stop anyone who tries. So there's a big word right here, abolitionist. An abolitionist is somebody who tries to fight to end slavery. So Esther knew that slavery was wrong, and she no longer wanted it to happen in our country. So again, she's being very brave and she's being very courageous, saying to these men, I will stop anybody who tries to stop these meetings. So still very determined, still very brave. When Esther was 28, she married Artemis Slack, and a few years later, they had a son called Archie. But when Artemis died in an accident, Esther made a big decision. I'm moving to Illinois, she told her friends. I'll claim the land Artemis owned there and raise our son. You can't do that, her friends cried. Illinois is the very edge of civilization. It's full of dangerous people and wild animals. Yes, she said, I can. And that was that. In Illinois, she fought long and hard to claim Artemis's land, but was denied her inheritance because she was female. So Esther opened another hat shop. Esther met and married John Morris, a merchant and immigrant from Poland. And in 1851, she gave birth to twin boys, Edward and Robert. But John was having a hard time making a living. So while Esther raised the children, cooked the meals, and washed the clothes, she helped earn money too. When Esther was 46, she went with John to the presidential election polls and watched through the window while he voted. You know, she told him, when he came out, I could do that. Politics is the business of men, my dear, he said. Humph, said Esther. It's our country, too. When war broke out between the northern and southern states, Esther was proud that Archie joined the victorious fight of the North to end slavery. Soon after, an amendment to the Constitution granted Negro men all rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. When Esther heard Susan B. Anthony speaking out about women's rights, Esther began to hope that someday women might vote too. So now, after the war, the men could still vote, but so could all the slaves that were just freed. So in this war, the slaves were free to become their own people, their own lives. They didn't have to work for somebody else anymore. And now they had the right to vote also. So Esther is hoping that someday women will too. In 1869, when Esther was 55, she and her 18-year-old sons moved to the newly formed Wyoming Territory, where John and Archie, who'd gone there the year before, waited for them. Esther and the boys traveled by train across miles of prairie, then by stagecoach over rocky hills to South Pass City, a dusty, hurriedly built town where gold had been found. Most of the 2,000 people who lived there were rowdy young men. They worked in the mines by day and partied at night. The Morrises moved their belongings into a small log cabin, and South Pass City became home. John ran a restaurant. Archie bought a printing press and started a newspaper. Esther opened another hat shop. But with 6 men to every woman, there was always a need for someone to nurse the sick and wounded, sew clothes, help deliver babies, and give motherly advice to the few young women in town. I could do that, Esther said, and she did. One day, Esther read a proclamation tacked to a wall. All male citizens 21 and older are called to vote in the first territorial elections. Esther looked around at the disorderly young men. It's time I did that. So Esther has been thinking about voting ever since she was a little girl. And she thinks when she sees this proclamation, this sign up on the wall, she thinks, now is the time that I should try and do this. So when Esther's son watched her march toward home, they knew it was more likely that things were about to change than that things would stay the same. Esther invited the 2 men running for the territorial legislation to her house to speak to the citizens. Then she sent out invitations to the most influential people in the territory. Come for tea and talk to the candidates. She scrubbed her tiny home from top to bottom, washed the curtains, and ironed her best dress. When the candidates and guests arrived, Esther served them tea. One thing I like about Wyoming, she said, is how everyone is important. It takes all of us to run the town, women as well as men. Yes, her guests agreed. And it's a place where people aren't afraid to try new things. Her guests agreed again. Esther smiled. She turned to the candidates. Then, if you were elected, would you introduce a bill in the legislature that would allow women to vote? Suddenly, in that tiny room full of people, not a sound was heard. Very quiet when she brought up that idea. Finally, Colonel William Bright spoke. Mrs. Morris, my wife, would like to vote too. She is intelligent and well educated. Truth be told, she would be a more informed voter than I. If I am elected, I will introduce that bill. Not wanting to be outdone, the other candidate also agreed. Applause broke out in that tiny cabin, and Esther dropped to her chair. Thank you, she said. People warned her that once the bill was introduced, the men of the legislature would have to approve it, and the governor would have to sign it. This had never happened anywhere. Why did she think it could happen here? But Esther had seen that things were not likely to happen. Happened every day. She wrote letters and visited legislators to make sure the bill would happen too. So she's saying that she's seen things that were not likely happen all the time. And if those things could happen, women being allowed to vote could probably happen too. And it did. On December 10th, 1869, Governor John Campbell signed the bill into law. Wyoming women get the vote. Women across the country rejoice for the women of Wyoming. Yee-haw! Yippee! Hurrah! Hurrah! But some people didn't like it. Only 8 days later, Judge James Stillman, the county's justice of the peace, turned in his resignation. He refused to administer justice in a place where women helped make the laws. Word went out that a new justice of the peace was needed. Esther's voice turned to her. Mama, you could do that, they said, and so she applied. Archie, then the clerk of the court, proudly swore his mother in, making Judge Esther Morris the first woman in the country to hold public office. But Judge Stillman refused to turn over the official court docket to Esther. Never mind, she said. Archie, will you please go to the mercantile and buy me a ledger? I'll start my own docket. And of course, she did. On September 6, 1870, 1 year after her tea party, Judge Esther Morris put on her best dress and walked with her husband John and her sons down the dusty street to the polling place. She would be one of 1,000 Wyoming women voting that day, the first ever given that right permanently by any governing body in the United States. As they walked, John, who still didn't think women should vote, tried to coach her on which candidates and issues to vote for. Esther held up her hands. I can do this, she said. And she did. So all throughout my story, Esther was determined about what she could do. All throughout the story, she's saying, I could do that. She was convinced that she could do things other people were doing, even as a woman. So when we think about retelling my story, I want you to think about all the important things that Esther did in her life. Think about how all the different ways that she was brave and she was determined. What are the things that she set out to do and accomplish because she chose to not give up and be brave and determined? That's what I want you to think about when you try to retell this story. Have Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time.